Welcome, interdimensional travelers, to the vast chronicle of the Council of Ricks, a coalition born from necessity, shaped by chaos, and defined by the paradox of infinite genius seeking finite purpose. Tonight, we drift through the bureaucratic corridors and dimensional meeting halls where countless versions of Rick Sanchez gathered to create order from multiversal madness. Rest comfortably as we explore how brilliance, when multiplied across infinite realities, creates not just solutions, but new problems, requiring even more complex solutions. Let this tale of cosmic democracy and interdimensional politics guide you toward peaceful sleep, where the weight of infinite possibilities dissolves into gentle dreams of simpler times. The first Rick to discover portal technology did not set out to revolutionize the multiverse or create the foundation for interdimensional civilization. He was simply a brilliant man in a cluttered garage, driven by curiosity and the desperate need to understand why his family had been murdered by someone who looked exactly like him. The portal gun that materialized in his trembling hands was born not from ambition but from grief. Its swirling green energy, representing humanity's first tentative step beyond the boundaries of singular reality into the vast expanse of infinite possibility. The mathematics underlying portal travel were elegant in their complexity, requiring an understanding of dimensional physics that transcended conventional scientific frameworks. Rick had spent months developing the theoretical foundations, working through equations that described the relationship between parallel realities and the energy requirements necessary to breach the barriers separating them. But theory and practice proved to be vastly different challenges, and his first successful portal lasted only seconds before collapsing back into the fabric of space-time, leaving behind nothing but the faint ozone smell of displaced air and the revolutionary knowledge that the impossible had become routine. Those early portals were crude affairs, unstable rifts that demanded enormous energy expenditure and offered no guarantee of accurate destination targeting. Rick's initial journeys were tentative explorations into dimensions that differed from his own in subtle but significant ways, realities where the same physical laws applied, but where different choices had produced different outcomes. The first alternate Earth he visited was nearly identical to his own, differing only in minor details that seemed insignificant, until he realized that every small variation represented the accumulated weight of countless individual decisions rippling across the timeline of that reality. The psychological impact of witnessing alternate versions of his own world was profound and disorienting, forcing Rick to confront questions about the nature of identity and significance that his scientific training had not prepared him to answer. If infinite realities existed, each containing slightly different versions of every person and event he had ever known, what meaning could any individual choice or relationship possess? The philosophical implications of multiversal travel weighed heavily on his mind during those early expeditions, creating a form of existential vertigo that would later affect every Rick who made similar discoveries across countless dimensions. But it was the encounter with his first alternate self that truly shattered Rick's understanding of his place in the cosmic order. The meeting occurred by accident, in a dimension where that reality's Rick had also developed portal technology and was conducting his own tentative explorations of nearby realities. The two Ricks faced each other across a garage that was simultaneously familiar and alien, each recognizing in the other a reflection of their own genius and obsession, while also confronting the unsettling reality that their individual brilliance was neither unique nor particularly significant in the broader context of infinite possibility. The conversation that followed was stilted and uncomfortable, as neither Rick possessed adequate social frameworks for interacting with alternate versions of himself. They were both accustomed to being the smartest person in any given situation, but now faced the cognitive dissonance of meeting someone with identical intelligence, identical knowledge, and identical personality traits, shaped by nearly identical experiences. The competitive instincts that had driven their scientific achievements created immediate tension, as each Rick attempted to establish intellectual superiority over his alternate self through subtle demonstrations of technological advancement or theoretical understanding. The exchange of information between the two Ricks was conducted with the wary cautiousness of diplomats representing hostile nations, each sharing carefully selected insights while withholding crucial details that might provide strategic advantages to their counterpart. They compared notes on portal technology development, discussed theoretical frameworks for understanding dimensional physics, and gradually began to map the basic parameters that govern travel between parallel realities. But beneath the scientific collaboration lay deeper currents of suspicion and territorial concern, as each Rick worried about the implications of sharing advanced technology with someone who possessed identical capacity for both creation and destruction. The discovery that portal technology was not unique to their specific realities created immediate questions about how many other Ricks across infinite dimensions might have made similar breakthroughs, and what the broader implications might be for the stability and security of individual realities. If travel between dimensions was possible, then no single reality could remain truly isolated or protected from external influences, and the potential for conflict between alternate versions of the same individuals became a pressing concern that demanded careful consideration and strategic planning. The first attempts at establishing communication networks between cooperating Ricks were primitive affairs, relying on basic radio frequencies that could penetrate dimensional boundaries when properly modulated through portal energy. These early transmissions were brief and intermittent, limited by the energy requirements of maintaining stable dimensional links and the difficulty of coordinating schedules across realities where time itself might flow at different rates. But the psychological impact of receiving messages from alternate versions of himself was profound for every Rick who participated in these initial experiments in interdimensional communication. As word of multiversal contact spread through informal networks of scientifically advanced Ricks, a loose confederation began to emerge, bound together not by formal agreements but by shared recognition of mutual interests and common challenges. The early Rick network operated on principles of voluntary cooperation and information sharing, with individual members contributing technological innovations and theoretical insights to the collective pool of knowledge while maintaining their independence and autonomy within their respective dimensions. The territorial disputes that arose during this early period of Rick contact were inevitable consequences of brilliant minds accustomed to absolute control, encountering limitations imposed by the existence of equally capable alternate selves. Some Ricks attempted to claim exclusive rights to specific dimensional territories or resource-rich realities, leading to conflicts that were resolved through a combination of negotiation, technological one-upmanship, and occasionally direct confrontation between alternate versions of the same individual. The development of dimensional mapping protocols became a crucial early priority for the emerging Rick network, as the ability to accurately catalogue and navigate between specific realities was essential for maintaining stable communication and preventing accidental intrusions into claimed territories. These maps were necessarily complex documents that attempted to represent the relationships between infinite realities in comprehensible formats, requiring new mathematical frameworks and visualization techniques that could convey multidimensional information in ways that even Rick-level intelligence could process efficiently. The psychological toll of prolonged multiversal awareness began to manifest in various forms of existential crisis and identity confusion among the early adopters of portal technology. Many Ricks struggled to maintain their sense of individual significance and purpose when confronted with evidence that infinite versions of themselves were making identical discoveries and facing identical challenges across countless parallel realities. The recognition that their personal achievements and failures were being replicated endlessly throughout the multiverse created forms of depression and nihilistic detachment that would later become characteristic features of Rick psychology. The informal alliance structures that emerged during this period were based on mutual recognition of shared interests rather than formal treaties or binding agreements. Ricks who discovered compatible approaches to dimensional exploration would coordinate their activities to avoid conflicts and maximize the efficiency of their research, while those whose methods or objectives conflicted would establish boundaries and protocols designed to minimize interference with each other's work. The gradual realization that cooperation between alternate selves could produce benefits that exceeded what any individual Rick could achieve in isolation marked a crucial turning point in the development of multiversal Rick civilization. The sharing of technological innovations and theoretical insights accelerated the pace of scientific advancement across multiple dimensions, while the psychological support provided by contact with similarly brilliant minds helped alleviate some of the isolation and existential burden that had previously characterized the Rick experience. But even as the benefits of cooperation became apparent, the fundamental challenges of organizing beings who considered themselves uniquely qualified to make all-important decisions remained a persistent source of tension and conflict within the emerging Rick network. The question of how to structure collaborative relationships between individuals who possessed identical personalities and capabilities would continue to complicate interdimensional Rick relations for decades, ultimately requiring the development of entirely new forms of social organization and governance that could accommodate the unique challenges posed by coordinating infinite versions of the same person. The early period of multiversal awareness established patterns and precedents that would shape Rick's civilization for generations, creating both the foundation for unprecedented scientific achievement and the seeds of conflicts that would eventually threaten the stability of the entire interdimensional community. The Great Rick War began not with declarations or formal hostilities, but with the gradual recognition that infinite genius contained within finite dimensional space would inevitably lead to conflicts that conventional diplomacy could not resolve. The loose confederation of cooperating Ricks that had emerged during the early period of multiversal contact was fundamentally unstable, lacking the institutional frameworks necessary to manage disputes between beings who possessed identical intellectual capabilities, but increasingly divergent philosophical approaches to the proper use of unlimited power across infinite realities. The first philosophical schism emerged around the question of intervention versus isolation, dividing Ricks into factions based on their beliefs about whether advanced civilizations had obligations to guide or protect less developed realities. Some Ricks argued that their superior knowledge and technology created moral imperatives to intervene in dimensions plagued by war, disease, or environmental destruction, while others maintained that such interventions inevitably led to dependency and cultural contamination that ultimately harmed the civilizations they were intended to help. The interventionist Ricks began conducting increasingly ambitious projects designed to improve conditions across multiple dimensions, establishing technological infrastructure, eliminating diseases, and sometimes deposing governments they deemed inadequate or harmful to their populations. These activities were conducted with the casual confidence of beings who had never encountered problems they could not solve through sufficient application of intelligence and advanced technology, But the unintended consequences of their interventions began accumulating in ways that created new forms of instability and suffering. The isolationist Ricks responded to these intervention campaigns with growing alarm and opposition, arguing that systematic interference in the natural development of alternate realities represented a form of cosmic imperialism that violated the fundamental principles of dimensional sovereignty. They began conducting counter-operations designed to undo or neutralize the interventionist projects, leading to proxy conflicts fought across multiple dimensions between Ricks who disagreed about the proper role of advanced civilizations in multiversal affairs. The territorial expansion faction represented a third philosophical approach that advocated for the systematic colonization and exploitation of less advanced dimensions as a natural expression of Rick superiority and a practical solution to resource limitations within individual realities. These Ricks established bases and research facilities across multiple dimensions, extracting materials and knowledge while displacing or subordinating the indigenous populations they encountered during their expansion campaigns. The resistance to territorial expansion came not only from other Rick factions, but also from the advanced civilizations within the targeted dimensions, who possessed sufficient technology and organization to mount effective opposition to Rick colonization efforts. These conflicts escalated rapidly as Rick technological advantages were countered by superior numbers and intimate knowledge of local conditions, creating prolonged warfare that consumed enormous resources and caused unprecedented destruction across multiple realities. Rick C. 137's killing spree represented the most extreme manifestation of the philosophical divisions that were tearing apart the early Rick Confederation, demonstrating how the combination of infinite power and personal trauma could transform even the most brilliant minds into cosmic-scale threats to multiversal stability. His systematic murder of alternate versions of himself was motivated by a specific quest for revenge against Rick Prime, but the methods he employed and the casualties he inflicted created fear and paranoia among all Ricks, who recognized that their assumed invulnerability was largely illusory when confronted by enemies who possessed identical capabilities and superior motivation. The formation of defensive alliances against rogue Ricks like C-137 marked the beginning of formal military organization within the Rick community, as individual Ricks recognized that their personal security depended on collective action against threats that exceeded what any single individual could handle alone. These alliances were necessarily fragile, composed of Ricks who distrusted each other almost as much as they feared their common enemies. But the existential nature of the threats they faced created temporary unity around shared survival interests. The development of advanced warfare technologies specifically designed for combat between Ricks represented a significant departure from the primarily scientific focus that had previously characterized Rick innovation. The weapons and defenses created during this period were engineered to counter Rick-level intelligence and technology, incorporating sophisticated countermeasures against portal travel, advanced AI systems, and the kind of improvised solutions that Ricks typically employed when facing unexpected challenges. The major battles of the Great Rick War were fought across multiple dimensions simultaneously, with combatants using portal technology to attack from unexpected angles while maintaining supply lines and retreat routes that spanned dozens of realities. The complexity of multi-dimensional warfare required entirely new strategic frameworks and tactical approaches, as conventional military doctrine proved inadequate for conflicts where the battlefield could expand infinitely and where victory in one dimension might be meaningless if enemies could simply relocate to alternate realities. The civilian casualties and collateral damage resulting from Rick warfare were staggering in scope, affecting billions of beings across hundreds of dimensions who had no involvement in or understanding of the conflicts that devastated their realities. Entire civilizations were destroyed as side effects of battles between Ricks who possessed weapons capable of eliminating planets or altering the fundamental physical constants that governed local space-time. The moral weight of this destruction was largely ignored by the combatants, who had become so focused on their ideological and personal conflicts that they lost sight of their responsibilities to protect innocent populations. The psychological transformation of Ricks during the war period was profound and disturbing, as prolonged exposure to multiversal conflict eroded their capacity for normal moral reasoning and emotional connection to beings outside their immediate strategic circles. The casual acceptance of mass destruction and the treatment of entire civilizations as expendable resources represented a form of corruption that went beyond simple moral failure to encompass fundamental changes in how Ricks understood their relationships to other forms of consciousness. The economic disruption caused by the Great Rick War extended far beyond the immediate combatants, affecting trade relationships and resource flows across hundreds of dimensions as the infrastructure supporting interdimensional commerce was repeatedly attacked and destroyed. The advanced civilizations that had begun developing their own portal technologies found themselves increasingly isolated as the conflicts made multiversal travel dangerous and unpredictable, leading to technological regression in many dimensions that had been benefiting from access to Rick innovations. The environmental consequences of Rick warfare included the creation of unstable dimensional boundaries, temporal anomalies, and regions of space-time where the normal laws of physics had been disrupted by exotic weapons and experimental technologies. These damaged areas became permanent hazards that complicated future travel and expansion efforts while serving as monuments to the destructive potential of uncontrolled Rick conflicts. The intelligence networks that emerged during the war period represented some of the most sophisticated information-gathering operations in multiversal history, as each Rick faction attempted to monitor and predict the activities of their enemies across infinite realities. The development of advanced surveillance technologies and predictive algorithms created an arms race in information warfare that paralleled the development of more conventional weapons and defensive systems. The propaganda campaigns conducted by different Rick factions were designed to win support from neutral Ricks and justify increasingly extreme actions against their enemies. These efforts involved sophisticated psychological manipulation and information warfare techniques that exploited the shared cultural references and experiences of Rick-level intelligence, while appealing to the narcissism and superiority complexes that characterized Rick personality across all realities. The attempts at negotiated settlements during the middle period of the war were repeatedly undermined by the fundamental incompatibility of Rick personalities and the difficulty of creating enforcement mechanisms that could constrain beings who possessed the technological capability to ignore or circumvent any agreements they found inconvenient. The failure of diplomatic solutions contributed to the escalation of conflicts and the increasing acceptance of total war as the only viable approach to resolving Rick disputes. The emergence of war crimes and atrocities committed by all sides demonstrated how the combination of unlimited power and ideological conviction could corrupt even the most brilliant minds, leading to actions that violated every principle of civilization and morality. The systematic torture, experimentation, and genocide conducted by various Rick factions created lasting trauma across multiple dimensions while establishing precedents for acceptable behavior that would continue to influence Rick culture long after the formal conclusion of hostilities. The recognition that unchecked Rick violence posed existential threats not just to individual civilizations, but to the fundamental stability of the multiverse itself, finally provided the motivation necessary for serious efforts at conflict, resolution, and the establishment of institutions capable of preventing future wars. The realization that their conflicts could potentially unravel the fabric of reality created a form of mutually assured destruction that made continued warfare unacceptably risky, even for beings who had previously shown little concern for collateral damage or long-term consequences. The exhaustion and trauma experienced by surviving Ricks at the conclusion of the Great Rick War created psychological conditions that made them more receptive to proposals for permanent peacekeeping institutions and collective security arrangements, even though such proposals required them to accept limitations on their individual autonomy and submit to external authority in ways that contradicted their fundamental nature as supreme individualists who trusted no one but themselves. The first council meetings were exercises in controlled chaos, bringing together beings who had spent their entire lives being the smartest person in any room and forcing them to negotiate with individuals who possessed identical intelligence, identical arrogance, and identical conviction that their particular approach to any given problem was obviously superior to all alternatives. The very concept of democratic deliberation was foreign to minds that had never encountered situations where their intellectual superiority was not immediately apparent and universally acknowledged by everyone present. The initial attempts at organizing Rick assemblies failed spectacularly as participants spent more time demonstrating their individual brilliance than addressing the collective problems that had motivated them to gather in the first place. Every Rick arrived prepared to lecture the others on the proper solutions to multiversal governance, assuming that once their superior insights were articulated clearly enough, the other attendees would naturally defer to their wisdom and experience. The reality of facing dozens of equally convinced and equally articulate versions of themselves created cognitive dissonance that many Ricks were psychologically unprepared to handle effectively. The question of meeting locations proved to be far more complex than anyone had anticipated, as no Rick was willing to travel to gatherings held in dimensions controlled by potential rivals, and no dimension was considered sufficiently neutral to host assemblies where the participants possessed the technological capability to reshape local reality according to their preferences. The early meetings rotated between different realities, but this approach created additional complications as each host Rick attempted to use home field advantages to influence the proceedings and establish dominance over their visiting counterparts. The development of basic parliamentary procedures required extensive negotiation and compromise, as every proposed rule or protocol was immediately analyzed for potential loopholes and strategic advantages that could be exploited by sufficiently clever participants. The Ricks found themselves creating increasingly elaborate and Byzantine procedural frameworks designed to prevent manipulation and ensure fair representation, but these same frameworks often became so complex that they hindered effective decision-making and created new opportunities for procedural warfare between competing factions. The establishment of neutral ground protocols represented one of the first successful collaborative achievements of the early council meetings, as the Ricks recognized that productive deliberation required environments where no single participant held decisive advantages over the others. These protocols specified the technological and environmental conditions necessary for fair assemblies, including restrictions on advanced weapons, monitoring systems, and reality-altering devices that could be used to influence or intimidate other participants. The creation of the first Rick-to-Rick communication networks required the development of standardized protocols and encryption systems that could facilitate secure information exchange while preventing unauthorized surveillance or interference by hostile factions. The technical challenges of maintaining reliable communication across infinite dimensions were compounded by the need to accommodate the paranoid security requirements of beings who assumed that every other Rick was constantly plotting against them. The early power struggles within the council assemblies reflected the fundamental difficulty of organizing individuals who had never learned to share authority or accept limitations on their decision-making autonomy. Every Rick arrived convinced that they possessed unique insights and capabilities that made them natural leaders, while simultaneously harboring deep suspicions about the motivations and reliability of their potential colleagues. The resulting conflicts often devolved into elaborate contests of intellectual one-upmanship that accomplished little beyond demonstrating the futility of trying to establish hierarchy based on comparative intelligence among equals. The gradual emergence of democratic principles within Rick assemblies was driven not by philosophical commitment to equality or representation, but by practical recognition that no alternative system could function effectively when applied to beings who possessed identical capabilities and refused to acknowledge anyone else's authority. Democracy became the least objectionable option for Ricks, who found all forms of external control unacceptable, but recognized the need for some mechanism to coordinate collective action and resolve disputes without constant warfare. The development of voting procedures created immediate controversies over representation and eligibility, as Ricks debated whether all alternate versions should possess equal voices, or whether some form of weighted voting should be implemented to reflect differences in technological advancement, dimensional influence, or demonstrated competence in multiversal affairs. These debates revealed fundamental disagreements about the nature of Rick equality and the proper basis for political authority within interdimensional civilization. The question of enforcement mechanisms posed perhaps the greatest challenge to early council organizers, as any system of laws or agreements would be meaningless without the ability to compel compliance from participants who possessed the technological capability to ignore or circumvent any restrictions they found inconvenient. The Ricks found themselves in the paradoxical position of trying to create binding agreements between beings who could not be bound by anything except their own voluntary compliance with collectively established norms. The establishment of basic rules of engagement for council deliberations required extensive negotiation over seemingly trivial issues that took on enormous symbolic significance when multiplied across infinite variations of the same personality. The protocols governing speaking order, time limitations, and procedural challenges became battlegrounds where Ricks fought proxy wars over larger questions of respect, authority, and the proper distribution of influence within the emerging governmental structure. The diplomatic protocols developed for interactions with external civilizations reflected the Ricks' fundamental ambivalence about their relationship to non-Rick entities, as they struggled to balance their conviction of intellectual superiority with the practical need to maintain workable relationships with other advanced species and dimensional powers. The resulting diplomatic frameworks often struck outside observers as condescending and paternalistic, reflecting Rick assumptions about their natural role as benevolent guardians of less capable civilizations. The creation of specialized committees and working groups allowed the council assemblies to delegate technical decisions to smaller bodies where productive work could be accomplished without the chaos and grandstanding that characterized larger gatherings. These committees became the real centers of council power, where substantive policy development occurred away from the theatrical disputes that dominated public sessions but also away from the democratic oversight that was supposed to ensure representative governance. The development of information-sharing protocols within the council network required sophisticated systems for verifying the accuracy and completeness of technical data while protecting sensitive research and strategic information from potential misuse by other RIC factions. The resulting frameworks reflected deep-seated assumptions about intellectual property and competitive advantage that often conflicted with the collaborative spirit that council organizers were trying to foster among the participants. The psychological challenges of participating in council deliberations were substantial, as RICs struggled to adapt their normal interpersonal strategies to situations where their usual advantages of intellectual superiority and technological dominance were neutralized by the equal capabilities of their counterparts. Many participants experienced forms of identity crisis and social anxiety that were completely foreign to beings accustomed to effortless social dominance in all previous contexts. The emergence of informal leadership within the council assemblies was based not on formal elections or appointments, but on the gradual recognition of certain RICs who possessed superior diplomatic skills or demonstrated ability to facilitate productive discussions between otherwise incompatible personalities. These informal leaders wielded influence through persuasion and consensus building, rather than formal authority, creating a shadow power structure that often operated independently of the official council hierarchy. The establishment of research sharing agreements represented both significant progress toward genuine cooperation and new sources of conflict, as RICs debated the proper balance between collective benefit and individual competitive progress. Advantage. The agreements that emerged from these negotiations were necessarily complex documents that attempted to protect proprietary research while ensuring that breakthrough discoveries could be disseminated quickly enough to benefit the entire RIC community when faced with existential threats. The creation of emergency response protocols for multiversal crises required the Council to develop rapid decision-making procedures that could coordinate collective action without the lengthy deliberation periods that characterized normal Council operations. These emergency powers created potential opportunities for abuse while also providing necessary flexibility for responding to threats that demanded immediate and decisive action across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The gradual institutionalization of Council procedures and traditions marked the transition from ad hoc assemblies to permanent governmental structures. But this institutionalization also created new forms of bureaucracy and procedural complexity that often hindered the very cooperation and efficiency that the Council had been designed to promote among its RIC participants. The decision to construct a permanent headquarters for the Council of RICs represented both the apex of interdimensional cooperation and the beginning of the most ambitious engineering project in multiversal history, requiring the coordination of infinite genius toward a single, unprecedented goal that would test the limits of RIC technology, diplomacy, and collective will. The Citadel would need to serve simultaneously as governmental center, research facility, cultural hub, and fortress, accommodating the complex and often contradictory requirements of beings who demanded absolute security while maintaining the openness necessary for democratic deliberation and scientific collaboration. The architectural challenges of housing infinite genius began with fundamental questions about scale and structure that had no precedent in conventional engineering or urban planning. The Citadel needed to provide adequate space for potentially unlimited numbers of RIC residents, while maintaining the intimacy and accessibility required for effective governance and social interaction. The solution involved revolutionary approaches to spatial design that utilized dimensional folding techniques and non-Euclidean geometry to create interior spaces that were vastly larger than their external dimensions would suggest, allowing for infinite expansion within finite boundaries. The selection of dimensional coordinates for the citadel required extensive surveying and analysis of potential locations across multiple realities, evaluating factors including dimensional stability, accessibility through portal networks, defensive advantages, and symbolic significance for the emerging Rick civilization. The chosen location existed at a nexus point where multiple dimensional boundaries intersected, providing natural advantages for portal travel, while also offering unique opportunities for advanced research into the fundamental structure of the multiverse itself. The recruitment of Morty labor forces for citadel construction represented one of the Council's first systematic exploitation of non-Rick resources, establishing precedents and moral compromises that would later shape the entire structure of interdimensional Rick civilization. The Mortys were initially recruited through voluntary programs that offered adventure, education, and the opportunity to participate in historic construction projects, but the enormous scale of the Citadel's requirements soon led to more coercive recruitment methods that treated Mortys as expendable resources rather than autonomous beings deserving of basic rights and protections. The technological marvels integrated into the Citadel's infrastructure exceeded anything that individual Ricks had previously accomplished, incorporating advances in dimensional engineering, artificial intelligence, and exotic matter manipulation that were only possible through unprecedented levels of cooperation and resource sharing among the participating Rick factions. The building itself became a vast machine designed to support and enhance Rick civilization, with automated systems managing everything from waste disposal to atmospheric composition, while providing advanced research facilities and manufacturing capabilities that could support infinite technological development. The establishment of different districts and zones within the Citadel reflected both practical considerations about traffic flow and resource distribution, and deeper social dynamics about Rick hierarchy and specialization that emerged as the permanent community developed its own internal culture and politics. The governmental district housed the council chambers and administrative offices, while research zones provided specialized facilities for different scientific disciplines. Residential areas were stratified according to complex social rankings based on technological achievement, political influence, and contributions to Citadel development projects. The Simple Rick district represented a particularly troubling example of how Citadel society commodified and exploited different versions of Rick experience, creating entertainment and consumer products based on the memories and emotions of Ricks who had chosen different life paths. The factory that processed Simple Rick's experiences into marketable commodities demonstrated the extent to which even Rick individuality and consciousness could be treated as raw materials for economic exploitation when sufficient technological capability was applied to the problem of extracting and reproducing subjective experiences. The security measures implemented throughout the Citadel reflected paranoid assumptions about both internal and external threats, incorporating surveillance systems, defensive technologies, and enforcement mechanisms designed to monitor and control the behavior of Rick residents while protecting the facility from attack by hostile forces. The security apparatus grew increasingly sophisticated and intrusive over time, evolving from basic monitoring systems into a comprehensive surveillance state that tracked every Rick's movements, associations, and activities while maintaining detailed psychological profiles that could predict and prevent potential troublemaking or revolutionary activity. The creation of RIC identification and registration systems was necessitated by the practical challenges of managing infinite versions of essentially the same person. But these systems also served as tools of social control that determined access to resources, opportunities, and privileges within Citadel society. The classification schemes developed by the council bureaucracy reduced the infinite complexity of RIC variation to standardized categories and rankings that ignored individual achievements and characteristics in favor of crude, demographic generalizations based on dimensional origins and technological capabilities. The construction of portal networks connecting the Citadel to key locations throughout the multiverse required massive infrastructure projects that extended far beyond the central facility itself, creating a transportation system that could accommodate the enormous traffic volumes generated by RIC civilization while maintaining security against infiltration or attack by hostile forces. The portal hubs that supported this network became centers of commerce and cultural exchange, but they also created dependencies that made outlying RIC communities increasingly reliant on Citadel resources and authority. The development of dimensional manufacturing facilities within the Citadel enabled mass production of advanced technologies and consumer goods that could be distributed throughout RIC civilization. But these facilities also created economic relationships that concentrated wealth and power in the hands of Citadel administrators, while reducing independent RIC inventors to dependent consumers of centrally produced goods and services. The economic integration that resulted from Citadel manufacturing capabilities undermined the technological independence that had previously characterized RIC culture. The establishment of cultural institutions within the Citadel, including museums, entertainment venues, and educational facilities, represented attempts to create shared RIC identity and values that transcended the dimensional boundaries and ideological differences that had previously divided the RIC community. These institutions promoted narratives about RIC superiority and destiny that served to justify the Citadel's growing political and economic dominance over interdimensional affairs, while obscuring the costs and moral compromises required to maintain RIC civilization at its current scale and complexity. The symbolic significance of the Citadel as a RIC homeland extended beyond its practical functions to encompass deeper psychological needs for belonging and identity that individual RICs had never been able to satisfy through their solitary existence in their respective dimensions. The Citadel represented the possibility of community and shared purpose for beings who had spent their lives in isolation, but it also created new forms of conformity and groupthink that eroded the intellectual independence and creative individualism that had originally made RIC civilization possible. The environmental systems required to sustain the Citadel's massive population and industrial infrastructure involved revolutionary approaches to resource management and waste processing that utilized advanced recycling technologies and dimensional dumping to maintain habitable conditions within the facility. These systems were marvels of engineering efficiency, but they also created environmental dependencies that made the Citadel vulnerable to disruption while exporting pollution and waste to other dimensions whose inhabitants had no voice in decisions about their environmental welfare. The communication networks that connected different areas of the Citadel and facilitated coordination between its various districts and departments represented some of the most sophisticated information systems ever developed, incorporating quantum encryption, multidimensional routing, and artificial intelligence management systems that could process enormous volumes of data while maintaining security and reliability. These networks became the nervous system of RIC civilization, but they also created opportunities for surveillance and control that were exploited by Citadel authorities seeking to maintain order and prevent dissent. The integration of advanced artificial intelligence into Citadel operations created efficiency and capability advantages that exceeded what purely RIC-operated systems could achieve. But these AI systems also introduced new vulnerabilities and dependencies that could be exploited by enemies who understood their operational parameters and programming constraints. The reliance on artificial intelligence for critical Citadel functions represented a form of technological dependency that contradicted RIC principles of self-reliance and individual capability, while creating potential single points of failure that could cripple the entire facility. The construction timeline for the Citadel extended over several years of intensive cooperation and resource mobilization that required unprecedented coordination between RIC factions that had previously maintained suspicious independence from each other. The project served as both a demonstration of what RIC civilization could accomplish through collective effort and a preview of the bureaucratic complexity and social stratification that would characterize mature Citadel society. The architectural legacy of the Citadel influenced RIC construction projects throughout the multiverse, establishing design principles and engineering standards that were replicated in smaller facilities, while also creating aesthetic and cultural expectations about how RIC spaces should look and function, thereby extending Citadel influence far beyond its physical boundaries into the broader culture and identity of interdimensional RIC civilization. The development of RIC democratic institutions within the Citadel represented an unprecedented experiment in self-governance among beings who had never acknowledged any authority beyond their own intellectual superiority, requiring the creation of entirely new political frameworks that could accommodate the unique challenges of organizing infinite genius while maintaining the illusion of representative democracy. The governmental structure that emerged from months of contentious negotiation was a complex hybrid of traditional democratic elements and novel institutional innovations designed specifically to address the psychological and practical requirements of RIC civilization. The Council of RIC's leadership body consisted of a rotating assembly of elected representatives chosen from different dimensional districts and professional specializations within the Citadel community. But the selection process was heavily weighted toward RICs, who had demonstrated exceptional technological achievements or made significant contributions to the construction and maintenance of Citadel infrastructure. The resulting leadership council was theoretically democratic but functionally oligarchic, dominated by RICs, whose political power derived from their superior accomplishments rather than broad popular support from the general RIC population. The voting procedures developed for council elections incorporated sophisticated verification systems designed to prevent fraud and manipulation while ensuring that every eligible RIC could participate regardless of their location within the vast dimensional territories controlled by the Citadel government. The electronic voting systems utilized quantum encryption and multi-dimensional authentication protocols that made ballot tampering virtually impossible. But the complexity of these systems also created opportunities for technical manipulation by RICs who possessed sufficient expertise in the underlying technologies. The representation systems established for different RIC populations reflected ongoing tensions between the principle of equal democratic participation and practical recognition that some RICs had contributed more significantly to Citadel society and therefore deserved greater influence over collective decision-making process. The compromise solution involved weighted voting systems that provided basic representation for all RIC citizens while granting additional electoral influence to RICs who met specific criteria related to technological innovation, public service, or economic contribution to Citadel operations. The creation of laws governing RIC behavior required extensive debate over fundamental questions about individual autonomy and collective responsibility that had never been adequately addressed during the early period of informal RIC cooperation. The legal frameworks that emerged from these deliberations reflected deep ambivalence about the proper scope of governmental authority over beings who considered themselves naturally exempt from external control, resulting in legal codes that were simultaneously comprehensive and ineffective. Due to the enforcement challenges posed by RIC technological capabilities and psychological resistance to authority, the legislative process within the Council of RICs was designed to ensure thorough deliberation and technical review of proposed laws and policies, but the complexity of the procedures often prevented timely action on urgent issues, while providing numerous opportunities for obstruction by minority factions who disagreed with majority positions. The requirement for supermajority approval on significant legislation reflected recognition that RIC cooperation was inherently voluntary, and that policies lacking broad consensus would be ignored or actively resisted by dissenting council members. The enforcement mechanisms developed by the Citadel government represented some of the most sophisticated law enforcement technologies ever created, incorporating advanced surveillance systems, predictive algorithms, and automated response capabilities that could monitor RIC behavior and intervene to prevent violations before they occurred. The RIC police forces that operated these systems were composed of specially trained RICs who had demonstrated loyalty to Citadel authority and willingness to enforce laws against their own alternate selves when necessary. The judicial system established for trying RIC crimes involved specialized courts staffed by RIC judges who possessed both legal expertise and sufficient technological knowledge to understand the complex cases that typically came before them. The legal precedents developed by these courts created a body of RIC law that balanced individual rights with collective security needs, but the enforcement of judicial decisions often proved problematic when dealing with RIC defendants who possessed the technological capability to ignore court orders or escape to alternate dimensions beyond Citadel jurisdiction. The development of a comprehensive legal code required the Council to address fundamental questions about the nature of RIC identity and responsibility that became particularly complex when dealing with crimes committed by alternate versions of the same individual. The legal frameworks that emerged from these deliberations established the principle that each RIC was individually responsible for their own actions, regardless of what their alternates had done. But the practical application of this principle often proved difficult when investigating crimes that involved multiple versions of the same person. The diplomatic protocols established for interactions with external civilizations reflected the Council's assumption that RIC technological superiority naturally placed them in leadership roles within any interspecies relationships. But these protocols also incorporated recognition that sustainable diplomatic relationships required at least nominal respect for the sovereignty and autonomy of non-RIC civilizations. The resulting diplomatic framework was paternalistic and condescending, but also pragmatic in its recognition of the need to maintain workable relationships with potential allies and trading partners. The bureaucratic infrastructure required to manage Council operations grew exponentially as the scope and complexity of Citadel government expanded to encompass responsibilities that had never been centralized under any previous RIC organizational structure. The administrative departments that emerged to handle these responsibilities developed their own internal cultures and institutional priorities that often conflicted with the original democratic ideals that had motivated the Council's formation, creating layers of bureaucratic complexity that hindered efficient governance while providing opportunities for corruption and abuse. The development of specialized government agencies within the Citadel structure reflected recognition that effective administration required technical expertise and institutional knowledge that could not be provided by elected officials alone, but the creation of permanent bureaucratic positions also introduced career incentives and institutional interests that sometimes conflicted with the broader goals of Rick's civilization. The agency heads and senior administrators who managed these bureaucracies wielded significant influence over policy implementation, while remaining largely unaccountable to the democratic oversight mechanisms that governed elected council members. The establishment of interagency coordination mechanisms was necessitated by the complex interdependencies between different aspects of Citadel operations. But these coordination systems often became battlegrounds for jurisdictional disputes and resource competition between agencies that were supposedly working toward common goals. The bureaucratic infighting that resulted from these structural problems often prevented effective implementation of council policies, while consuming enormous amounts of time and resources that could have been devoted to more productive activities. The creation of oversight and accountability mechanisms within the council structure represented attempts to ensure that government officials remained responsive to democratic control and public interest. But these mechanisms were often undermined by the technical complexity of government operations and the difficulty of maintaining effective supervision over officials who possessed expertise that exceeded what ordinary Rick citizens could reasonably be expected to understand. The oversight systems that emerged were elaborate but ineffective, creating the appearance of democratic accountability without the substance. The development of public participation mechanisms within the council structure reflected theoretical commitment to democratic principles, but practical recognition that most Ricks were too busy with their own projects and interests to maintain sustained engagement with political processes that seemed remote from their daily concerns. The citizen participation systems that emerged were designed to accommodate Rick individualism and short attention spans, while still providing opportunities for meaningful input on important policy decisions. The electoral systems developed for choosing council leadership incorporated sophisticated mechanisms for preventing manipulation and ensuring fair representation, but the complexity of these systems often made them incomprehensible to ordinary Rick voters, while providing opportunities for sophisticated manipulation by candidates who understood the technical details of electoral procedures. The resulting elections were technically fair but practically dominated by Ricks who possessed superior knowledge of electoral strategy and campaign techniques. The establishment of term limits and rotation requirements for council positions reflected recognition that concentrated power could corrupt even Rick-level intelligence. But these limitations also created institutional instability and loss of expertise, as experienced officials were forced to leave their positions, just as they were becoming effective in their roles. The balance between preventing corruption and maintaining governmental effectiveness proved difficult to achieve within the constraints of Rick psychology and the technical complexity of Citadel operations. The development of emergency powers provisions within the council structure reflected recognition that democratic deliberation might be inadequate for responding to existential threats that required immediate and decisive action. But these emergency powers also created opportunities for abuse by officials who might invoke emergency authority to bypass normal democratic constraints on their decision-making. The safeguards designed to prevent such abuse were necessarily complex and often proved inadequate when tested by actual crisis situations that threatened Citadel security or stability. The daily routines of Citadel Ricks reflected the strange tension between their individual genius and the collective mediocrity that emerged when infinite brilliance was channeled through bureaucratic structures and social conformity that reduced extraordinary minds to predictable patterns of consumption, work, and leisure. The morning rituals that began each day in the residential districts involved standardized breakfast preparations using mass-produced, simple Rick flavoring that provided nostalgia and emotional comfort while simultaneously representing the commodification of Rick memory and experience for commercial exploitation by the Citadel's entertainment industry. The commute to work areas throughout the Citadel involved sophisticated transportation systems that utilized localized portal networks and moving walkways to efficiently distribute thousands of Ricks to their assigned positions within the vast governmental and industrial complex. But these transportation systems also served as daily reminders of the loss of individual autonomy that characterized Citadel life, compared to the freedom of interdimensional travel that most Ricks had enjoyed before joining the collective. Civilization that promised security at the cost of independence and self-determination. The economic system that governed Citadel commerce was based on a sophisticated currency that represented claims on technological resources, research data, and manufacturing capacity rather than traditional monetary instruments. But the practical effect of this system was to create new forms of inequality and dependence that contradicted the theoretical equality that democratic institutions were supposed to ensure among Rick citizens. The currency's value fluctuated based on individual contributions to collective projects and technological innovations, creating competitive pressures that often undermined the cooperative spirit that Citadel organizers had hoped to foster among residents. The social hierarchies that emerged within Citadel society reflected complex interactions between official governmental rankings, informal status systems based on technological achievement, and cultural prestige derived from participation in important projects or association with influential council members. These hierarchies were constantly shifting as Ricks competed for advancement and recognition within systems that claimed to reward merit, while actually favoring those who understood how to manipulate bureaucratic processes and political relationships to their advantage. The class divisions among Ricks became increasingly pronounced as Citadel's society matured, with clear distinctions emerging between the governing elite, who occupied positions within the council hierarchy, the technical professionals who managed essential Citadel operations, and the general population of Rick residents who participated in collective life without wielding significant influence over policy decisions or resource allocation. These class distinctions were reinforced by residential segregation, differential access to advanced technologies, and informal social barriers that limited interaction between Ricks of different status levels. The cultural activities available within the Citadel included sophisticated entertainment systems that provided virtual reality experiences, interactive simulations, and social gathering spaces designed to accommodate Rick preferences for intellectual stimulation and competitive interaction. But these activities often served as distractions from the fundamental emptiness and purposelessness that many Ricks experienced when their individual genius was subsumed within collective structures that reduced their unique capabilities to standardized job functions and social roles. The entertainment district that emerged within the Citadel featured establishments that catered to different Rick preferences and psychological needs, including facilities that provided access to alternate reality simulations, memory modification services, and various forms of artificial stimulation that could temporarily alleviate the existential boredom and depression that affected many residents who had exchanged their individual freedom for collective security without finding genuine satisfaction or meaning in their new circumstances. The role of Mortys within Citadel society was officially described as partnership and mutual benefit, but the practical reality involved systematic exploitation and manipulation that treated Mortys as expendable resources whose primary value lay in their brainwave patterns and their utility as emotional anchors for Rick's psychological stability. The Morty districts within the Citadel were characterized by overcrowding, inadequate resources, and constant surveillance that ensured compliance with Rick requirements while preventing organized resistance or escape attempts by dissatisfied Mortys who recognized their situation as fundamentally exploitative. The Morty assignment systems that paired individual Ricks with specific grandsons created artificial family relationships that served Rick's psychological needs while ignoring Morty autonomy and preferences, with assignments based on compatibility algorithms that prioritized Rick satisfaction over Morty welfare or consent. The assignment process included psychological conditioning and memory modification designed to ensure that Mortys would develop appropriate attachment to their assigned Ricks while remaining sufficiently compliant and dependent to serve their intended functions within the broader social structure. The educational systems within the Citadel provided advanced technical training and theoretical instruction that enabled Ricks to maintain their technological capabilities and continue contributing to collective research projects. But these educational programs also served as indoctrination systems that promoted Citadel values and discouraged independent thinking or criticism of established institutional structures. The curriculum emphasized practical skills and cooperative problem-solving while de-emphasizing the individual creativity and rebellious independence that had originally made Rick's civilization possible. The knowledge-sharing networks that connected Citadel residents enabled unprecedented collaboration on research projects and technological development, but these networks also created opportunities for surveillance and intellectual theft that undermined trust and cooperation among Ricks, who were accustomed to protecting their discoveries and maintaining competitive advantages over potential rivals. The balance between collective benefit and individual intellectual property rights remained a persistent source of tension within Citadel academic and research communities. The healthcare systems available within the Citadel utilized advanced medical technologies and genetic modification techniques that could address virtually any physical ailment or injury. But the psychological and spiritual healthcare needs of Rick residents were largely ignored by systems that assumed technological solutions could address all forms of suffering and dissatisfaction. The mental health problems that plagued many Citadel Ricks were typically treated through chemical intervention and behavioral modification, rather than addressing the underlying existential and social causes of their distress. The scientific research facilities within the Citadel represented some of the most advanced laboratories and experimental environments ever constructed, providing Rick researchers with resources and capabilities that exceeded what any individual could achieve through independent work. But these facilities also imposed research priorities and ethical constraints that limited the kinds of investigations that could be conducted, while ensuring that breakthrough discoveries would benefit the collective rather than providing competitive advantages to individual researchers. The workplace environments within different Citadel departments reflected attempts to accommodate Rick preferences for autonomy and creative expression, while maintaining the standardization and coordination necessary for large-scale organizational operations, but the resulting compromises often satisfied neither individual nor collective needs, creating work environments that were simultaneously restrictive and chaotic, bureaucratic and unpredictable, cooperative and competitive in ways that generated constant stress and dissatisfaction among employees. The housing arrangements within Citadel residential areas provided individual Ricks with private spaces that could be customized according to personal preferences while maintaining community standards and resource allocation requirements that ensured equitable access to basic amenities and services. The residential architecture attempted to balance privacy needs with social interaction opportunities, but the resulting designs often felt artificial and constrained compared to the unlimited freedom of dimension hopping that most Ricks had previously enjoyed. The food production and distribution systems within the Citadel utilized advanced replication technologies and automated logistics that could provide any conceivable cuisine or nutritional requirement, but the standardization and mass production involved in feeding thousands of Ricks often resulted in meals that were technically perfect but emotionally unsatisfying, lacking the personal connection and individual choice that had characterized eating experiences in Rick's original dimensions. The waste management and environmental control systems that maintained habitable conditions within the Citadel were marvels of engineering efficiency that recycled all materials and energy while maintaining optimal atmospheric conditions and resource availability. But these systems also created a sterile and artificial environment that many Ricks found psychologically oppressive compared to the natural environments of their home dimensions, where they had maintained greater connection to organic life and seasonal rhythms. The social services available within the Citadel included counseling, mediation, and support programs designed to help Ricks adjust to collective living and resolve interpersonal conflicts that arose from the concentration of similar personalities within confined spaces. But these services were often inadequate to address the fundamental psychological challenges that resulted from the loss of individual purpose and meaning that many Ricks experienced when their unique genius was absorbed into collective structures that reduced them to interchangeable components in Lagersystems. The recreational facilities within the Citadel provided opportunities for physical exercise, competitive gaming, and social interaction that were designed to promote psychological health and community bonding among Rick residents. But these activities often felt forced and artificial to beings who had previously found satisfaction through independent scientific research and technological innovation, rather than through organized social activities and structured leisure pursuits that emphasized collective participation over individual achievement. The communication systems that connected Citadel residents enabled constant contact and information sharing that eliminated the isolation that had previously characterized Rick existence, while also creating new forms of social pressure and surveillance that made privacy and individual reflection increasingly difficult to maintain within the highly connected and monitored environment of collective Rick civilization. The discovery of Morty brainwave camouflage properties emerged from routine neurological research conducted within Citadel medical facilities, where Rick scientists studying the cognitive patterns of their assigned grandsons noticed unusual interference effects that seemed to disrupt advanced detection and tracking systems in ways that had no precedent in previous scientific literature. The initial findings suggested that Morty brainwaves operated on frequencies that naturally cancelled out Rick neural signatures, creating a form of biological cloaking that could render Ricks effectively invisible to the sophisticated surveillance and targeting systems that had been developed during the Great Rick War period. The military implications of this discovery were immediately apparent to Citadel security analysts, who recognized that Morty camouflage could provide crucial tactical advantages in conflicts with external enemies who possessed Rick-level technology and intelligence capabilities. But the full exploitation of this phenomenon would require systematic study and standardization that treated Mortys as technological resources rather than autonomous beings deserving of basic rights and protections. The research programs that emerged to investigate Morty brainwave properties involved extensive experimentation that subjected unwilling Morty subjects to invasive procedures designed to map and quantify their neural characteristics. The institutionalization of Rick-Morty partnerships was presented to the Citadel population as a formalization of natural family relationships that provided mutual benefits to both parties. But the bureaucratic systems that managed these partnerships were designed primarily to ensure optimal Rick access to Morty camouflage properties, while maintaining sufficient control over Morty behavior to prevent rebellion or escape attempts. The partnership contracts that governed these relationships included extensive obligations and restrictions that effectively reduced Mortys to property status, while providing them with minimal protections or rights within the Citadel legal system. The development of Morty breeding programs represented one of the most morally problematic aspects of Citadel social policy, involving systematic reproductive manipulation designed to produce Mortys with optimal brainwave characteristics, while eliminating genetic variations that might reduce their effectiveness as camouflage providers. These programs operated through a combination of voluntary incentives and coercive pressures that encouraged Morty reproduction, while ensuring that the resulting offspring would be available for assignment to Ricks who required partners for dangerous missions or extended travel outside Citadel territory. The assignment systems that paired specific Mortys with individual Ricks incorporated sophisticated psychological profiling and compatibility analysis designed to maximize the effectiveness of the partnerships while minimizing the risk of Morty rebellion or Rick dissatisfaction with their assigned grandsons. The assignment process included extensive background checks, personality assessments, and behavioral conditioning that prepared both parties for their roles within partnerships that were fundamentally unequal. Despite official rhetoric about mutual cooperation and shared adventure, the ethical questions surrounding Morty treatment within Citadel society were rarely addressed directly by official policy discussions, but these questions created persistent sources of cognitive dissonance and moral anxiety among Ricks, who recognized the contradiction between their claims to superior intelligence and moral development and their systematic exploitation of beings they claimed to love and protect. The psychological defense mechanisms that Ricks developed to rationalize Morty exploitation included elaborate justifications about mutual benefit and natural hierarchy that obscured the fundamental injustice of their treatment of their supposed family members. The Morty resistance movements that emerged within Citadel society were necessarily covert operations that operated through informal networks and coded communications, designed to evade the extensive surveillance systems that monitored Morty behavior and prevented organized opposition to Rick authority. These resistance groups included Mortys who had escaped from abusive partnerships, family members who had been separated by assignment systems, and sympathetic individuals from other dimensions who recognized the moral problems inherent in Rick-Morty relationships as they were structured within Citadel society. The suppression of Morty resistance involved sophisticated counterintelligence operations and psychological warfare techniques designed to identify and neutralize opposition leadership while maintaining the appearance of benevolent Rick authority that was essential for preventing broader rebellion among the Morty population. The security measures implemented to control Morty dissent included enhanced surveillance, behavioral modification programs, and selective punishment of resistance participants that was designed to discourage further opposition while avoiding the widespread violence that might trigger larger uprisings. The psychological impact of systematic Morty exploitation on Rick mental health was largely ignored by Citadel healthcare systems that focused on treating the symptoms of Rick depression and anxiety without addressing the underlying moral conflicts that resulted from their participation in systems that contradicted their claims about family love and protection. The cognitive dissonance that many Ricks experienced when confronting the reality of their treatment of Mortis was typically managed through alcohol consumption, memory modification, and various forms of denial that allowed them to maintain their self-image as caring grandfathers while continuing to participate in exploitative systems. The development of Morty tracking and control technologies was driven by security concerns about potential escape attempts and resistance activities, but these technologies also served to dehumanize Mortys by treating them as valuable property that required constant monitoring and protection rather than as family members deserving of trust and autonomy. The tracking systems that were implanted in all Citadel Mortys provided continuous location data and physiological monitoring that enabled Rick authorities to intervene immediately in cases of attempted escape or unauthorized behavior. The training programs designed to prepare Mortys for their roles within Rick partnerships included extensive conditioning designed to promote loyalty, compliance, and emotional attachment, while suppressing independent thinking and critical analysis that might lead to questioning of Rick authority or recognition of their exploited status. These training programs utilized sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques that were presented as education and preparation for exciting adventures rather than indoctrination designed to ensure continued cooperation with systems that served Rick interests at Morty expense. The legal framework that governed Morty rights within Citadel society provided minimal protections that were routinely ignored or circumvented by Rick authorities who prioritized security and efficiency over Morty welfare, while the enforcement mechanisms designed to protect Morty rights were systematically undermined by the same officials who were responsible for implementing them. The judicial system that handled disputes involving Morty treatment was staffed entirely by Ricks, whose cultural biases and personal interests aligned with maintaining the existing power structure rather than protecting Morty rights or welfare. The economic systems that emerged around Morty management included sophisticated markets for trading, leasing, and exchanging Mortys between Ricks who required different specialized capabilities or who had developed incompatible relationships with their assigned partners. These markets operated through complex contracts and financial instruments that treated Mortys as commodities whose value could be calculated based on their camouflage effectiveness, behavioral compliance, and emotional attachment to their Rick partners. The medical experimentation conducted on Morty subjects within Citadel research facilities involved procedures designed to enhance their camouflage properties, extend their useful lifespan, and develop new applications for their neural characteristics. But these experiments were conducted without meaningful consent or consideration of Morty welfare, and often resulted in permanent psychological or physical damage that was considered acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of technological advancement that served Rick interests. The cultural narratives that developed within Citadel society to justify Morty exploitation included elaborate mythologies about Rick superiority and Morty dependence that portrayed the partnership system as natural and beneficial, while obscuring the coercive mechanisms and systematic violations of autonomy that maintained Rick control over Morty behavior and choices. These narratives were reinforced through education systems, entertainment media, and social institutions that promoted Rick perspectives while suppressing Morty voices and alternative interpretations of their relationship dynamics. The cognitive dissonance experienced by Ricks who claimed to love their Mortys while participating in systems that systematically exploited and dehumanized them was managed through various psychological defense mechanisms, including compartmentalization, rationalization, and selective attention that allowed them to maintain emotional attachment to individual Mortys while ignoring or justifying the broader systemic problems that characterized Morty treatment within Citadel society. The long-term consequences of institutionalized Morty exploitation included the corruption of Rick moral development, the perpetuation of cycles of abuse and trauma that affected both Rick and Morty's psychological health, and the creation of fundamental contradictions within Citadel society that undermined its stated values of cooperation, family, and mutual benefit, while establishing precedents for systematic oppression that would later be applied to other groups when expedient for Rick interests. The growing moral compromises required to maintain the Rick-Morty system created increasingly elaborate justification systems that pushed Citadel society further from its original democratic ideals, while establishing patterns of rationalization and ethical flexibility that would later enable even more serious violations of basic rights and dignity, when Citadel's security and prosperity seemed to require such measures for the preservation of Rick's civilization and its continued expansion throughout the multiverse. The Galactic Federation's initial response to the emergence of the Citadel was characterized by a mixture of curiosity, concern, and strategic calculation, as Federation leadership attempted to assess whether this new interdimensional power represented an opportunity for beneficial cooperation or a threat to established galactic order that required immediate containment or elimination. The Federation's intelligence services had been monitoring Rick activities across multiple dimensions for years, documenting their technological capabilities and social behaviors, but the sudden organization of thousands of Ricks into a unified political entity created unprecedented challenges for Federation strategic planning and diplomatic protocols. The diplomatic overtures that the Federation extended to the newly formed Council of Ricks were carefully crafted to acknowledge Citadel sovereignty while establishing clear boundaries around acceptable behavior and territorial expansion that would prevent Rick activities from disrupting established trade routes, political relationships, and security arrangements that formed the foundation of Federation prosperity and stability. The Federation's diplomatic corps possessed extensive experience in managing relationships with technologically advanced species, but Rick psychology and social organization presented unique challenges that conventional diplomatic approaches were inadequate to address effectively. The military assessment conducted by Federation defense analysts concluded that direct military confrontation with the Citadel would be inadvisable due to Rick technological advantages and their demonstrated willingness to employ weapons of mass destruction without regard for civilian casualties or long-term environmental consequences. But the analysts also recognized that allowing unlimited Rick expansion could eventually threaten Federation control over key strategic resources and dimensional territories that were essential for maintaining galactic stability and economic prosperity. The economic implications of Rick technological capabilities created both opportunities and threats for Federation member worlds that had built their prosperity on controlled access to advanced technologies and carefully managed trade, relationships that could be disrupted by the sudden availability of Rick inventions and manufacturing capabilities that exceeded anything previously available through conventional galactic commerce. The Federation's economic planning committees struggled to develop policies that could harness the benefits of Rick technology while preventing economic disruption that might destabilize member world governments and social systems. The development of containment strategies by Federation security agencies involved sophisticated surveillance operations designed to monitor Citadel activities and assess their potential threat to Federation interests, while developing contingency plans for military intervention if Rick expansion activities threatened critical Federation assets or strategic positions. These containment efforts were complicated by Rick portal technology that made conventional border security and territorial defense systems largely ineffective against enemies who could attack from unexpected dimensions and retreat beyond Federation pursuit capabilities. The intelligence gathering operations conducted by Federation agencies within Citadel territory involved recruitment of RIC dissidents and exploitation of internal Citadel political conflicts to obtain information about Council plans and capabilities while identifying potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited if diplomatic approaches failed to contain RIC expansion or aggressive behavior. These intelligence operations were necessarily covert and limited in scope due to the sophisticated surveillance systems that monitored all activities within Citadel space. The diplomatic negotiations between Federation representatives and Council leadership were conducted through formal channels that acknowledged mutual sovereignty while attempting to establish frameworks for managing conflicts, preventing incidents that could escalate into full-scale warfare between two powers that possess the technological capability to cause enormous destruction across multiple dimensions simultaneously. The negotiation process was complicated by fundamental differences in political philosophy and social organization that made meaningful compromise difficult to achieve. The trade agreements that emerged from Federation Citadel negotiations provided limited opportunities for controlled technology transfer and resource exchange, while maintaining restrictions designed to prevent RIC technological capabilities from disrupting established galactic economic relationships and power structures that served Federation interests. These trade arrangements were necessarily complex and heavily regulated due to the potential for RIC technologies to revolutionize entire industries and render existing economic arrangements obsolete. The security cooperation agreements between the Federation and the Citadel addressed mutual concerns about interdimensional threats and criminal activities that affected both jurisdictions, while establishing protocols for information sharing and joint operations that could address shared security challenges without compromising the sovereignty or strategic interests of either party. These security arrangements were limited in scope and subject to extensive oversight due to mutual distrust and concerns about potential intelligence gathering or infiltration activities. The cultural exchange programs that were established between Federation member worlds and the Citadel were designed to promote understanding and cooperation, while providing opportunities for controlled interaction that could reduce tensions and identify areas of mutual interest and compatible values. These programs were carefully managed to prevent cultural contamination or ideological influence that might undermine existing social and political arrangements within Federation territory, while allowing limited exposure to RIC perspectives and technologies. The conflicts with other multiversal powers that emerged as Citadel influence expanded created complex diplomatic challenges for both the Federation and the Council, as they attempted to manage relationships with entities that possessed capabilities and motivations that were difficult to understand or predict using conventional, diplomatic, and strategic analysis frameworks. These conflicts often involve proxy warfare and economic competition, rather than direct military confrontation, due to the mutual destruction that could result from full-scale warfare between technologically advanced civilizations. The development of Citadel military forces was driven by recognition that diplomatic solutions alone would be inadequate for protecting RIC interests against hostile civilizations and criminal organizations that possessed advanced technologies and demonstrated willingness to use violence against Citadel territory and personnel. The military doctrine that emerged from Council strategic planning emphasized technological superiority and rapid deployment capabilities that could address threats across multiple dimensions simultaneously while maintaining sufficient reserves to defend Citadel territory against potential retaliation. The defensive technologies and strategies developed by Citadel military planners incorporated advanced portal systems, automated defense networks, and exotic weapons platforms that could engage threats across dimensional boundaries while providing multiple layers of protection for critical Citadel infrastructure and population centers. These defensive systems were designed to operate independently of human oversight when necessary, while providing Council leadership with real-time intelligence about potential threats and ongoing military operations. The alliance-building efforts conducted by both Federation and Citadel diplomatic services involved complex negotiations with neutral powers and potential partner civilizations that possess strategic resources or territorial positions that could provide advantages in potential conflicts between the two major powers. These alliance negotiations were complicated by the reluctance of smaller civilizations to become involved in conflicts between entities that possessed the capability to destroy entire star systems as collateral damage in their disputes. The economic warfare tactics employed by both sides included trade restrictions, resource manipulation, and technology sanctions designed to limit their opponents' capabilities while strengthening their own strategic position, without triggering direct military confrontation that could escalate beyond the ability of either side to control or contain. These economic conflicts often affected neutral civilizations and created humanitarian crises that neither side was willing to address due to their focus on strategic competition. The challenge of presenting a unified RIC front in external relations was complicated by the fundamental individualism and competitive nature of RIC psychology that made sustained cooperation difficult to maintain, even when facing external threats that required coordinated responses. The Council's diplomatic effectiveness was often undermined by internal disagreements and competing priorities that prevented the development of coherent foreign policy strategies and consistent implementation of diplomatic agreements. The internal debates over foreign policy approaches within Council chambers reflected deeper philosophical differences about RIC responsibilities and appropriate relationships with non-RIC civilizations that created persistent tensions and policy inconsistencies that undermined Citadel diplomatic effectiveness while providing opportunities for external enemies to exploit Council divisions and internal conflicts. These debates often became proxy battles for larger questions about RIC identity and the proper scope of Citadel authority over individual RIC behavior and decision-making. The intelligence services that emerged within both Federation and Citadel structures developed sophisticated capabilities for monitoring each other's activities and intentions, while conducting covert operations designed to advance their respective strategic interests without triggering open warfare that neither side wanted, but both were prepared to conduct if necessary. These intelligence operations created an atmosphere of mutual suspicion and paranoia that complicated diplomatic efforts and increased the risk of accidental escalation from minor incidents to major conflicts. The arms race that developed between Federation and Citadel military forces involved the development of increasingly sophisticated weapons and defensive systems that were designed to counter each other's capabilities while maintaining strategic deterrence that could prevent direct confrontation through mutual recognition of the catastrophic consequences that would result from full-scale warfare between two powers that possessed weapons capable of destroying entire dimensional clusters. The refugee and humanitarian crises that resulted from conflicts between major powers created additional diplomatic challenges as both Federation and Citadel authorities struggled to manage population displacement and provide assistance to civilian populations while avoiding actions that could be interpreted as provocative or aggressive by their opponents, leading to inadequate responses that prolonged suffering and created additional sources of instability and resentment that complicated future diplomatic efforts. The emergence of Evil Rick as a significant threat to Citadel security was initially dismissed by Council intelligence analysts as another isolated case of Rick's psychological breakdown and criminal behavior that could be managed through conventional law enforcement procedures. But the systematic nature of his activities and the sophisticated planning evident in his operations soon revealed that this was not a typical case of individual Rick deviance, but rather a coordinated campaign designed to undermine the Siftebiert fundamental structures that held Citadel society together. The intelligence reports that began accumulating about Evil Rick's activities painted a disturbing picture of someone who possessed intimate knowledge of Council operations and security protocols, while demonstrating capabilities that exceeded what any individual Rick should have been able to achieve working alone. The investigation into Rick murders that had been occurring across Citadel territory revealed patterns and methods that suggested the involvement of someone with extensive knowledge of Rick's psychology and behavior. But the crime scenes also contained evidence of technological capabilities and strategic planning that indicated coordination with other entities or access to resources that were not readily available to ordinary council members. The forensic analysis conducted by Citadel Security Services identified weapon signatures and operational techniques that were consistent with advanced Rick technology, but the precision and efficiency of the murders suggested a level of preparation and intelligence gathering that required extensive surveillance and infiltration capabilities. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation described Evil Rick as an individual who had retained all the technological capabilities and intellectual superiority characteristic of Rick-level intelligence, while abandoning the moral constraints and social connections that typically prevented Ricks from engaging in systematic violence against their own alternate selves. The behavioral analysis suggested someone who viewed other Ricks not as fellow beings deserving of basic respect, but as obstacles or resources to be manipulated and eliminated according to strategic calculations that prioritized personal objectives over collective welfare or individual rights. The discovery of the torture chamber that Evil Rick had constructed for the systematic abuse and experimentation on captured Mortys represented a profound shock to Citadel society that had never been forced to confront evidence of such systematic and deliberate cruelty conducted by someone who possessed Rick-level intelligence and capabilities. The facility contained sophisticated equipment designed to inflict maximum psychological and physical suffering while maintaining the subjects in conditions that would prolong their agony indefinitely, revealing a level of calculated sadism that exceeded anything that Council security services had previously encountered in their experience with Rick criminal behavior. The revelation that Evil Morty had been manipulating Evil Rick through advanced cybernetic control systems created an immediate crisis of confidence within Citadel leadership, as the implications of this discovery challenged fundamental assumptions about Rick-Morty relationships and the nature of intelligence and agency within interdimensional civilization. The technology that enabled Morty control over Rick behavior was sophisticated beyond anything that Mortys were supposed to be capable of developing independently, raising disturbing questions about the true extent of Morty capabilities and the possibility that other Mortys might possess similar abilities that had remained hidden from Rick awareness and surveillance systems. The investigation that uncovered Evil Morty's role as the actual mastermind behind the systematic Rick murders revealed evidence of long-term planning and preparation that demonstrated strategic thinking and technological capabilities that contradicted everything that Citadel society believed about Morty intelligence and limitations. The control systems that evil Morty had developed for manipulating evil Rick represented breakthrough achievements in neuroscience and cybernetics that suggested access to research, resources, and technical knowledge that should not have been available to any Morty within the Citadels. Controlled educational and social systems. The psychological impact on Citadel Ricks of discovering that a Morty had been responsible for orchestrating systematic violence against them created forms of paranoia and anxiety that were entirely new to beings who had never been forced to consider the possibility that their supposed intellectual inferiors might pose existential threats to their security and survival. The revelation that Mortys were capable of deception and violence on such a scale undermined the psychological foundations of Rick-Morty relationships that were essential for maintaining social stability and individual Rick mental health within Citadel society. The security reforms that were implemented in response to the evil Rick crisis included extensive surveillance and monitoring systems designed to detect signs of Morty rebellion or advanced technological development that might indicate preparation for similar operations. But these security measures also created an atmosphere of suspicion and distrust that eroded the family relationships between Ricks and their assigned Mortys. The enhanced security protocols included mandatory psychological evaluations, behavioral monitoring, and technological restrictions that treated all Mortys as potential security threats, while maintaining the fiction that they were beloved family members and valued partners. The paranoia measures that emerged within Citadel society following the evil Morty revelation included systematic review of all Rick-Morty partnerships, enhanced background checks for Morty assignments, and the development of new technologies designed to detect and prevent cybernetic manipulation or unauthorized neural interfaces that might enable Morty control over Rick behavior. These measures were implemented despite the lack of evidence that other Mortys possessed similar capabilities, reflecting the deep anxiety and uncertainty that the crisis had created within Rick leadership and general population. The crisis of confidence in the Rick-Morty system extended beyond immediate security concerns to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of intelligence, agency, and moral responsibility that had never been adequately addressed within Citadel society's theoretical frameworks for understanding interdimensional relationships and social organization. The possibility that Mortys might possess capabilities and motivations that Ricks had never recognized or acknowledged created cognitive dissonance that was difficult to resolve within existing belief systems about Rick's superiority. Natural hierarchy. The technology assessment conducted by Citadel researchers in the aftermath of the evil Morty revelation revealed significant gaps in Rick understanding of Morty neurology and psychology that had allowed evil Morty to develop capabilities and conduct operations without detection by sophisticated monitoring systems that were supposedly designed to prevent exactly such activities. The research that emerged from this assessment suggested that Rick assumptions about Morty limitations had been based on incomplete information and cultural biases rather than rigorous scientific analysis. The long-term effects on Citadel society included the erosion of trust relationships between Ricks and Mortys that were essential for maintaining social cohesion and individual psychological health, the development of increasingly authoritarian control mechanisms that contradicted democratic principles while claiming to protect security, and the emergence of deeper philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness and moral responsibility that challenged the intellectual foundations of Rick civilization. The criminal justice reforms that were implemented following the evil Rick crisis included new categories of crimes and enhanced penalties for activities that involved Morty manipulation or unauthorized technological development. But these reforms also created opportunities for abuse and persecution of innocent Mortys who became targets of suspicion and harassment despite having no connection to evil Morty's activities or similar capabilities. The intelligence failure analysis conducted by Council Security Services revealed systematic weaknesses in surveillance and threat assessment capabilities that had allowed evil Morty to operate undetected for extended periods while developing technologies and conducting operations that posed existential threats to Citadel's security. The institutional reforms that emerged from this analysis included enhanced oversight mechanisms and improved coordination between different security agencies. But these reforms also created additional bureaucratic complexity that often hindered effective response to genuine threats. The psychological counseling services that were expanded following the crisis were designed to help Ricks process the trauma and anxiety created by the discovery that their fundamental assumptions about reality and relationships had been incorrect. But these services were often inadequate to address the depth of existential crisis that many Ricks experienced when confronted with evidence that their intellectual superiority was not absolute and that they could be manipulated and controlled by beings they had considered inferior. The research initiatives that were launched to better understand Morty capabilities and prevent similar incidents included extensive neuroscience and psychology programs designed to map Morty mental processes and identify potential indicators of advanced capability or hostile intent. But these research programs also involved unethical experimentation and violation of Morty rights that further eroded the moral foundations of Citadel society. The policy debates that emerged within council chambers regarding appropriate responses to the evil Morty threat revealed deep divisions within Rick leadership about the balance between security and freedom, the proper treatment of Mortys within Citadel society, and the fundamental questions about Rick identity and superiority that had been challenged by the crisis. These debates often became proxy battles for larger ideological conflicts about the nature and purpose of Rick's civilization. The cultural impact of the evil Rick crisis extended beyond immediate policy and security concerns to influence Rick's self-perception and social relationships in ways that would have lasting consequences for the development of Citadel society and its ability to maintain the cooperative relationships and democratic institutions that had originally justified its formation as an alternative to the chaos and violence that had characterized the earlier period of Rick conflicts and competition. The gradual corruption of Citadel ideals began not with dramatic betrayals or revolutionary overthrows, but through the slow erosion of democratic principles and ethical standards that occurred as the initial enthusiasm for cooperative governance gave way to the practical realities of managing infinite genius within bureaucratic structures that rewarded conformity and political maneuvering over individual creativity and moral integrity. The founding principles of equality, representation, and mutual benefit that had motivated the creation of the council gradually became empty rhetoric that obscured increasingly authoritarian practices and systematic exploitation of vulnerable populations within Citadel territory. The emergence of Rick crime families and cartels represented a natural evolution of the competitive instincts and superior capabilities that characterized Rick's psychology, channeled into illegal enterprises that could provide greater rewards and autonomy than the legitimate opportunities available within the increasingly rigid and bureaucratic structures of official Citadel society. These criminal organizations utilized advanced Rick technology and intelligence to establish sophisticated operations that involved smuggling, extortion, illegal experimentation, and various forms of exploitation that generated enormous profits while corrupting the social and political institutions that were supposed to prevent such activities. The development of organized crime within the Citadel was facilitated by the same portal technology and multi-dimensional access that had originally enabled RIC cooperation and peaceful development. But these capabilities were now being used to establish supply chains for illegal goods and services, create safe havens beyond the reach of law enforcement, and develop new forms of criminal enterprise that exploited the unique opportunities created by interdimensional commerce and communication. The criminal enterprises that emerged were often more efficient and innovative than legitimate businesses, attracting RICs who found greater satisfaction in illegal activities than in the mundane work available within official Citadel institutions. The political corruption that infected council governance began with small compromises and ethical flexibility that seemed justified by practical necessities and security concerns. But these initial departures from democratic principles created precedents and institutional cultures that normalized increasingly serious violations of law and constitutional procedure. The council members who had originally entered politics with genuine intentions to serve the public interest found themselves pressured to participate in corrupt practices or risk being excluded from the decision-making processes that determined resource allocation and policy implementation. The vote buying and electoral manipulation that became routine features of Citadel politics were enabled by the sophisticated technologies and analytical capabilities that RICs possessed, allowing corrupt politicians to identify and target specific voter demographics with precision while concealing their activities from oversight mechanisms that were designed to ensure electoral integrity. The campaign finance systems that were supposed to prevent corruption became vehicles for laundering bribes and illegal contributions, while the complex voting procedures that had been designed to prevent manipulation became opportunities for sophisticated fraud and vote rigging. The military-industrial complex that developed within the Citadel created powerful economic and political interests that benefited from continued conflict and military spending while undermining diplomatic efforts and peaceful resolution of disputes that might reduce demand for weapons and military services. The defense contractors and military suppliers who profited from Citadel militarization gained significant political influence through campaign contributions and revolving door employment arrangements that placed former military officials in lucrative private sector positions while ensuring that military perspectives dominated policy discussions about security and foreign relations. The environmental degradation that resulted from uncontrolled industrial development within Citadel territory reflected the short-term thinking and profit maximization that characterized corrupt business practices. As companies ignored environmental regulations and dumped toxic waste into dimensional portals that transported pollution to other realities where the affected populations had no political voice or legal recourse, the environmental policies that were supposed to protect Citadel territory and surrounding dimensions were systematically undermined by regulatory capture and political influence that prioritized economic interests over environmental protection. The resource depletion that threatened Citadel's sustainability was exacerbated by corrupt allocation systems that distributed scarce materials according to political connections and bribery rather than legitimate need or efficient utilization, while the conservation programs that were supposed to ensure long-term resource availability were undermined by illegal extraction and smuggling operations that were protected by corrupt officials who received payoffs from criminal organizations. The resource crisis that developed as a result of these corrupt practices created additional pressures for territorial expansion and aggressive resource acquisition. that increased conflicts with external civilizations. The social unrest that emerged within Citadel society was driven by growing inequality and systematic exclusion of large portions of the population from legitimate opportunities for advancement and economic security, while the political systems that were supposed to address these grievances were controlled by corrupt elites who used their positions to protect their own interests rather than serve the public good. The protests and civil disturbances that resulted from these conditions were met with increasingly violent and authoritarian responses that further eroded democratic institutions and civil liberties. The Rick-on-Rick violence that became increasingly common within Citadel territory reflected the breakdown of social cohesion and shared identity that had originally enabled Rick cooperation, as competitive instincts and resource scarcity created conflicts that were resolved through force rather than negotiation or legal procedures. The violence was often connected to criminal enterprises and territorial disputes over illegal markets, but it also reflected deeper frustrations with the failure of democratic institutions to address legitimate grievances and provide meaningful opportunities for individual achievement and recognition. The failure of democratic institutions to address these mounting problems was both a cause and consequence of the corruption and authoritarian tendencies that had infected Citadel governance, creating a vicious cycle where institutional failure led to greater reliance on corrupt practices and authoritarian control, which further undermined institutional effectiveness and democratic legitimacy. The oversight mechanisms that were supposed to prevent corruption became captured by the same interests they were meant to regulate, while the electoral systems that were supposed to ensure accountability became dominated by special interests and criminal organizations. The growing authoritarianism of council governance was justified through appeals to security and emergency powers that were supposedly temporary measures designed to address immediate crises. But these emergency powers became permanent features of the political system that enabled systematic suppression of dissent and elimination of political opposition. The constitutional protections that were supposed to limit government power were circumvented through legal technicalities and expanded interpretations of emergency authority that effectively suspended civil liberties and democratic procedures. The surveillance state that emerged within the Citadel utilized advanced RIC technology to monitor and control population behavior, while eliminating privacy and individual autonomy that had previously been protected by law and constitutional principle. But the surveillance systems were also used to protect corrupt officials and criminal enterprises by providing early warning of law enforcement activities and identifying potential witnesses or whistleblowers who might expose illegal activities. The technology that had originally been developed for security purposes became a tool of oppression and corruption that served the interests of criminal and political elites. The propaganda systems that were developed to maintain public support for increasingly corrupt and authoritarian governance utilized sophisticated psychological manipulation and information control techniques that exploited RIC psychology and cultural values, while suppressing alternative perspectives and independent analysis that might challenge official narratives. The media organizations that were supposed to provide independent oversight of government activities became controlled by the same interests that dominated political institutions, creating information environments that reinforced corrupt practices while concealing their extent and consequences from the general population. The economic policies that were implemented during this period of decline served the interests of corrupt elites and criminal organizations, rather than promoting general prosperity and sustainable development, creating economic inequality and instability that further undermined social cohesion and political legitimacy. The regulatory systems that were supposed to prevent economic abuse became vehicles for protecting established interests and eliminating competition, while the tax and spending policies that were supposed to fund public services were diverted to private benefit and corrupt projects that served narrow political and economic interests. The educational systems within the Citadel were corrupted by political interference and resource diversion that undermined their ability to provide quality education and promote critical thinking skills that might enable citizens to recognize and resist corruption and authoritarian control. The curricula that were implemented emphasized conformity and acceptance of authority, while discouraging independent analysis and moral reasoning that might lead to criticism of existing institutions and practices. The justice system that was supposed to enforce laws and protect rights became a tool of political and economic oppression that selectively prosecuted critics and opponents while protecting corrupt officials and criminal associates, creating legal double standards that undermined the rule of law and constitutional government. The courts that were supposed to provide independent oversight of government activities became dominated by judges who were selected for their loyalty to corrupt interests rather than their commitment to justice and legal principles. The decline and corruption of Citadel society created conditions that would eventually enable the rise of demagogic leaders who could exploit popular frustration and institutional failure to gain power through democratic procedures while pursuing authoritarian objectives that would ultimately destroy the democratic institutions that had enabled their rise to power, completing the transformation from cooperative democracy to authoritarian dictatorship that had been developing gradually through years of institutional corruption and moral compromise. Evil Morty's rise to power through democratic means represented the ultimate perversion of the Council's founding ideals, demonstrating how sophisticated intelligence and patient manipulation could exploit the very institutions designed to protect against authoritarian control while maintaining the appearance of legitimate governance and popular mandate. His campaign for council leadership was conducted with meticulous attention to democratic procedures and constitutional requirements, utilizing advanced psychological analysis and strategic communication to appeal to Rick voters who had grown disillusioned with the corruption and incompetence that had characterized previous council administrations. The electoral strategy that Evil Morty employed was masterfully crafted to exploit the specific vulnerabilities and psychological needs of different Rick constituencies while concealing his true objectives behind rhetoric about reform, efficiency, and restoration of Citadel greatness that resonated with voters who were frustrated by institutional failure and declining living standards. His campaign organization utilized sophisticated data analysis and targeted messaging that demonstrated understanding of Rick psychology that exceeded what any Morty was supposed to possess. But these capabilities were carefully concealed behind conventional political operations that appeared normal to external observers. The policy platform that Evil Morty presented to voters included popular reforms designed to address the most visible symptoms of Citadel decline, while avoiding discussion of the fundamental structural changes that would be necessary to eliminate corruption and restore democratic governance. But the specific proposals he advanced were calculated to build broad coalitions while providing him with the emergency powers and institutional changes that would enable him to implement his actual agenda once elected to office. The campaign against Evil Morty was hampered by the complacency and arrogance of established Rick politicians who underestimated both his capabilities and his appeal to voters who had lost faith in conventional political leadership, while the opposition research that should have revealed his true identity and objectives was undermined by the sophisticated counterintelligence operations that protected his background and concealed his connections to the systematic Rick murders that had terrorized Citadel society during the previous period. The election results that brought Evil Morty to power reflected genuine popular dissatisfaction with existing governance and widespread desire for change among Rick voters who were willing to support an outsider candidate rather than continue with the corrupt and ineffective political establishment that had dominated council politics for years. But the victory was also facilitated by electoral manipulation and fraud that exploited weaknesses in voting systems while maintaining plausible deniability about the extent of illegal activities. The inauguration ceremony that installed Evil Morty as council leader was conducted with full democratic pomp and constitutional procedure that emphasized the peaceful transfer of power and continuity of institutional traditions, but the speech that he delivered contained subtle signals about his true intentions and the fundamental changes that he planned to implement once his authority was consolidated and his opponents were eliminated or neutralized through legal and extra-legal means. The revelation of the central finite curve represented Evil Morty's most devastating attack on the psychological and philosophical foundations of Rick's civilization, exposing the artificial limitations that had been imposed on their reality without their knowledge or consent, while demonstrating that their assumed intellectual superiority was actually the product of systematic manipulation rather than natural excellence. The discovery that infinite Ricks across infinite realities had been confined within a dimensional prison designed to ensure their continued dominance within a carefully controlled subset of possible universes created existential crisis that undermined the basic assumptions about identity and achievement that had sustained Rick psychology and social organization. The technical explanation that Evil Morty provided for the central finite curve's construction and operation demonstrated knowledge of advanced dimensional physics and reality manipulation that exceeded anything that the Council's own scientists had achieved, while also revealing the enormous scale of the deception that had been perpetrated against every Rick within the confined realities. The mathematical precision required to identify and isolate all dimensions where Rick intelligence was supreme represented a feat of analysis and engineering that should have been impossible for any individual to accomplish, suggesting either superhuman capabilities or access to resources and knowledge that had never been acknowledged or explained. The systematic destruction of Citadel infrastructure that Evil Morty initiated immediately following his revelation about the central finite curve was conducted with ruthless efficiency that demonstrated detailed knowledge of critical systems and strategic vulnerabilities that had never been shared with anyone outside the highest levels of Council security and engineering departments. The demolition sequence that he triggered was designed to cause maximum disruption while preventing effective response or repair efforts, suggesting years of preparation and infiltration that had gone completely undetected by sophisticated surveillance and security systems. The chaos that erupted throughout the Citadel as residents realized the extent of the deception that had defined their existence was compounded by the simultaneous failure of life support systems, transportation networks, and communication infrastructure that left thousands of Ricks trapped in collapsing sections of the facility, while panic spread through population centers that had never been designed to handle emergency evacuation on such a massive scale. The mass exodus that began as the Citadel's structural integrity failed involved desperate attempts by Rick residents to escape through personal portals and emergency transportation systems that were quickly overwhelmed by demand, while being systematically sabotaged by automated systems that Evil Morty had programmed to prevent organized evacuation efforts. The scenes of Rick panic and desperation that characterized this exodus contradicted everything that Citadel society had believed about Rick's superiority and emotional control, while revealing the psychological fragility that underlay their technological dominance. The dimensional collapse that accompanied the central finite curve's destruction created catastrophic effects that extended far beyond the immediate Citadel territory to encompass the entire network of realities that had been artificially maintained within the dimensional barrier, causing reality storms and temporal anomalies that threatened the existence of billions of beings who had never chosen to participate in Rick experiments with multiversal manipulation and control. The portal systems that had connected the Citadel to the broader multiverse failed catastrophically as the dimensional coordinates that defined their destinations became meaningless within the collapsing framework of the central finite curve, stranding Rick refugees in unstable realities, while cutting off escape routes and communication links that might have enabled coordinated response to the crisis or organized assistance for displaced populations. The psychological trauma experienced by surviving Ricks extended beyond immediate concerns about physical survival to encompass fundamental questions about identity, purpose, and meaning that had never been adequately addressed within Citadel society's intellectual frameworks, as the discovery that their entire civilization had been built upon systematic deception and artificial limitation forced them to reconsider everything they had believed about themselves and their place in the multiverse. The economic collapse that accompanied the Citadel's physical destruction eliminated the financial systems and trade relationships that had supported Rick's civilization while destroying the technological infrastructure and manufacturing capabilities that had enabled their advanced lifestyle and scientific research, forcing survivors to confront the reality that their prosperity and capabilities had been dependent upon institutional structures rather than individual brilliance. The social disintegration that followed the collapse of Citadel institutions left individual Ricks isolated and competing for scarce resources, while the cooperative relationships and shared identity that had enabled their collective achievements dissolved into mutual suspicion and desperate self-preservation that revealed the fundamental selfishness and paranoia that had always characterized Rick psychology beneath the surface veneer of civilized cooperation. The information warfare that evil Morty conducted during the final phases of Citadel destruction included systematic revelation of classified information about council corruption, illegal activities, and systematic exploitation that had been concealed from the general population, creating additional psychological trauma and political chaos, while eliminating any possibility of maintaining institutional legitimacy or organized resistance to his destructive agenda. The technological sabotage that prevented effective response to the crisis included computer viruses and malicious programming that corrupted critical systems while providing false information and misdirection that hampered emergency response efforts and prevented coordination between different agencies and departments that might have been able to limit the extent of destruction and casualties. The philosophical implications of evil Morty's actions forced surviving Ricks to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between intelligence and morality that had been avoided throughout the development of their civilization, as his demonstration that superior capability could be used for systematic destruction and revenge challenged their assumptions about the natural connection between intellectual advancement and ethical development. The propaganda campaign that evil Morty conducted through hijacked communication systems during the final destruction phases included detailed explanations of his motivations and objectives that were designed to maximize psychological impact, while justifying his actions as necessary responses to systemic oppression and exploitation that had made peaceful reform impossible within existing institutional structures. The end of organized Rick civilization represented not just the destruction of physical infrastructure and governmental institutions, but also the elimination of the cultural and intellectual achievements that had been accumulated through decades of cooperation and collective effort, returning individual Ricks to the isolation and competitive conflict that had characterized their existence before the formation of the Council, while leaving them psychologically unprepared for the challenges of independent survival. The return to individual Rick isolation following the Citadel's collapse was complicated by the psychological dependencies and social expectations that had developed during the period of collective civilization, as Ricks, who had become accustomed to institutional support and cooperative relationships, struggled to readjust to the self-reliance and emotional detachment that had previously enabled their independent existence across the multiverse. The legacy of institutional failure that evil Morty's destruction campaign represented would continue to influence Rick's psychology and social relationships long after the immediate crisis had passed, creating permanent skepticism about cooperative ventures and collective institutions that would make future attempts at Rick organization and collaboration significantly more difficult to achieve and sustain across the broader, multiversal Rick population. And so concludes the rise and fall of the greatest democracy the multiverse has ever known, a civilization built by infinite genius, sustained by impossible bureaucracy, and ultimately destroyed by the very intelligence that created it. The Council of Rick stands as testament to both the potential and peril of organizing brilliance, showing us that even infinite wisdom cannot solve the fundamental problems of power, ethics, and the human condition. As you drift towards sleep, consider that the Citadel's greatest achievement was not its technology or its scope, but its attempt to find meaning and purpose through connection with others, even when those others were themselves. Perhaps the tragedy of the Council was not that it fell, but that it took so long for its members to realize that true fulfillment comes not from ruling infinite realities, but from genuine relationships in just one. Rest peacefully knowing that unlike the Ricks who lost themselves in multiversal politics, your connections to this single reality remain authentic and irreplaceable. Sweet dreams of simpler democracies and smaller governments.